Okay, so we are now recording. Let me, what we're doing is we're going to continue from what we did last month. Remember, what we're doing is we're discussing the issue of Noahides and Rabbis, and we're trying to get you to understand the rabbis that you're going to be interacting with today. So we talked about first the rabbinic authority itself, how very expansive it is and what it is. And then we're talking about the traditions of how the authority comes down today, how it actually works practicality. And eventually we're going to get to, so you will understand the different rabbis you speak to, where they're coming from, how qualified they are to talk. And so you have a bit of an understanding on your own, which rabbis it's good to listen to. They might have nice talks, but you don't want to ask them a question about Noahide laws, or people you want to ask Noahide laws, but they're not really good people who could know how to give lectures and stuff like that. Different things like that. So, because again, fundamentally, that's the biggest problem Noahides have is who to ask. Okay. So we are holding at the 11th century. So let's do a very quick review. We discussed that from the time of Moshe until the first destruction of the first temple, there is a clear distinction from Moshe to the Yeshua, to the elders, and going down through the prophets until they get to the exile into Babylonia, where the last of the prophets were. The last of the prophets were a group together called the Men of the Great Assembly, that's what we call them, where they came together, they put together the Tanakh, basically, with a whole bunch of things, and set things up for the next level. Now, again, I want to emphasize that every time we talk about a new period of time, it's because there was a recognition that in quality, the people in that time making decisions were not on the same level as those before him. Okay, so prophecy ends in Babylonia. Next generation, they weren't prophets anymore. Okay, and we see continually what's going on is that there's a change in the quality. And many times the quality is based on the fact that politically, sociologically, things went on. So the first temple is destroyed. We have a whole new period going on because things change like that. And we'll see that, again, we're seeing that this is happening all the time. That's why I'm bringing in the history in addition to bringing the names of how it comes down to us, because you can see how these things affected it. When we say there was a change in the qualities, because things happen which makes it more difficult to maintain the high standard that was beforehand. So a different, lower standard is going on. Okay? That's why you'll see rabbis always defer to rabbis of previous generations or whatever. Okay, so we have, coming back from the exile, Shimon Tzaddik, we have a number of generations. We get to Hillel until we get to the destruction of the Second Temple. Again, the destruction of the Second Temple was an important thing, but it was not fatal to the people, because people still lived in Israel, the Holy Land. They moved to a different place. They were in Yavne, and they went to different places where they could still keep the central authority. And this continued until the Mishnah, which was written down in around 200 with Yehuda Chassid, Yehuda Anasi. And again, Yehuda Anasi wrote it down. Why? Because the political situation of the Roman Arab Empire was turning very bad. After Yehuda Anasi wrote down, after the Mishnah was written, it came a time of great turbulence and political instability during the 3rd century in Rome. And such a situation, when there's political instability and things like that are going, it's very hard to keep certain levels of learning. When there's interruptions and you're constantly persecution. But also after the Mishnah, another thing started happening in Persia, where the Jewish people had lived, and there were always communities there, but not a center of Torah learning. We see in Babylonia, we see people from Israel go into there, and the communities in Babylonia start building up. You start seeing yeshivas there, they start building up. And that goes where the Talmud gets finished in Jerusalem, because the Christian persecutions got so bad that basically the community collapsed, and the Babylonian community took over after that with the 2 main yeshivas there. And that ended somewhere around the 600s when the Talmud was written, because corresponding to that, there was a period of time where the Persians were actually persecuting the Jewish people. It's a time of persecution. Okay, so that sort of ended. We have, after that, following a number of years, a period of time We call it the Rabbis, the rabbis who are clarifying things. They put the Talmud in the form that we have it now, putting dots between different places, dividing up it is. There's these smaller tractates that exist. They put those together from things. They basically finished it up. Nothing really new, but much finishing up the Talmud as it was and everything like that in that period. Following that, they're starting the period of the Gaonim. The Gaonim actually start when the founding of the two yeshivas, Sira Pumbedisa, the main ones. There was one in Nahardua, which goes in and out, but Sira Pumbedisa were the main ones, where the Gaon was there. And these were the main sources, the main centers of Torah learning until the 11th century. And there was, of course, the political entity of Reish Galusa in that time also. It also existed in 11th century. And this existed through the Persians. When Persia fell to the Muslim invaders in the 7th century, this also continued. There was not the interruption there that we would later find out and we would later see in other parts of the Muslim world. And it continued until the 11th century. What happened in the 11th century is essentially an influx for the Seljuk Turks, the invasion from the Turks. The Mongolians invaded before him, but the Turks came in. And with the Turkish invasion, the whole system there basically reached a collapse. The yeshivas were closed. And the center of Torah learning ended there and moved to other places where, while they had been learning there, they weren't centers on the same level. And these centers are going to be two fundamentally different ones. And you can actually look at them as two different spheres based on the religion that was predominant there. There was a Christian religion, which was in Germany, all this country there. We called it Ashkenaz. Ashkenaz is a Hebrew name for Germany. So the Ashkenazim are those who came from there, Germany, France, whatever. We'll see later on it goes to other places. But that was basically the area under Christian control. The other area was called Sfard from the Spanish. That was primarily in the beginning in North Africa and Spain. There were again Jews in the Holy Land. Also, for example, the Masoretes lived in the Holy Land in I think in the 10th, 11th century. They dealt with the text, but there was really not a center of Torah learning. The center of Torah learning then goes from there in Sephardic lands, was basically in Spain and North Africa. And we'll see what happens. North Africa basically drops off in Spain. Is it not that there weren't other places? The Rambam ends up going to Egypt and other places. So it wasn't that there wasn't anything, but here we're talking about specifically the main Torah centers. These are the places where our traditions come down from. The rabbis who taught there and the works that came from there are the ones that for later generations are of the most significance. Okay, again, not that there weren't people there in the Holy Land. There were always people in the Holy Land. The Crusaders came. When they came to Jerusalem, they slaughtered Muslims and Jews in there. So there were Jews always. But again, the times living in this place were much more turbulent, seemed to be more settled, and that's what it was. So let's start with we're going to deal with the Rishonim. Okay, and we're basically going to cover the Rishonim we're going to get basically through the 16th century. Okay, which is the beginning of that Rishonim. So we're going to do the Rishonim first. Now, as we do this, we have to keep one eye on historical events, and we're going to see how these historical events are extremely important. Okay, so we see here the first community of importance there is really in North Africa. Now, there in Spain also there was, but in North Africa there were a number of people there. Even during the time of the Gaonim, towards the end, there were two very key figures in North Africa. One was Rabbi Hanana, one was Rabbi Nissim. They were Talmudists. Their primary work was on the Talmud. Rabbi Hanana has a wonderful commentary on that's printed in the Talmud on the side, Sectus Bruchas. Very wonderful, very nice Talmud. Fundamentally, the commentaries from the Rishonim are unique and very different from the Achrayim. Okay, you could tell the difference. It's very hard, the qualitative type of a difference it is in the clarity in the text and the elucidation of the text that you see from them. So the Rabbi Hanan is one of the nice ones that there are. It's on a number of Masechtas. Rabbi Nissim also. Most importantly, that as far as we're concerned, because what we are interested in is basically the halachic tradition of how it comes down to us. The Talmud tradition, of course, affects it, but the halacha tradition, those who wrote works on halacha, in North Africa, there was a very famous rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Fasi. Al-Fasi is a Hebrew name for Fez, which is in Morocco, Al-Fasi. His name is an acronym, the RIF, and his work is extremely important for halacha. When one studies according to the halacha, which I was in a kollel, which we learned that, when one studies, the RIF is after the Talmud, the RIF is one of the most important things we look at. What happened is in North Africa, because of persecution, there were prohibitions about the Talmud. So what the RIF did is he made a book, a cipher, and what he did, he excerpt from the Talmud all of the legal decisions, final conclusions for the legal decisions, put into one place. So when you read it through, you could read like, a short amount there, it takes a number of pages of Talmud, and you can see that basically he's telling you the conclusions, a little bit of the arguments of what's going to. This was an extremely important and influential work. Even until today, it's very important. He lived in North Africa. Now, he lived in North Africa from 1013 to 1103. What's important to know is he's actually the last person in North Africa of any importance. And the reason is an event that occurred in the 12th century. Now, North Africa and Spain were basically under the same kingdom, and they were basically Muslims, but they were more moderate, I could say. They weren't as problematic. In the 12th century, a group called the Almohads took over. They were fanatical Muslims. They persecuted the Jews in North Africa, so that basically after this time, we don't know of any North African rabbis of any importance until we get much, much, much later. Okay. And as far as halacha conditions, since I don't know the Sephardim very well, I know the Abba Chatzor family was from Morocco, who were very big Kabbalists and rabbis. But I'm not sure as far as the how Sephardic Psak goes, how they decide to halacha. So I'm a little weaker on that. I know more about Ashkenaz, obviously. But you don't really find anything significant there until much, much later. Okay. So that's Almohads. Almohads. I don't know exactly the pronunciation. Now, this has a significant importance in the next place we're going to discuss, and that's Spain. We're doing this for the Sephardim first here in Spain. Okay. Now, in the 12th century, there were a few things going on at one time. The Muslims conquered all of Spain. They went up into Europe. There was a famous battle with Charles Martel in 713 or something like that, sometime in that period of time, where he defeated the Islamic armies coming in and basically stopped Islam from going into Europe. Okay, and after that time, there came what in Spain is called Reconquista. Reconquest. At the time, it wasn't really so much what's called. It was called the Crusade. It was a crusade, just like there was a crusade in the Holy Land. There was a crusade there. Both of them were basically for the same reason. Forget about what they tell you, the lies. Basically, both of them were the same reason. The Muslims had taken the Holy Land from the Byzantine Empire, and they were causing problems. So there was a call to take it back, return it to the way it was before, under Christian control. And it was the same thing was done in Spain. Spain was successful, but there in the Holy Land, it wasn't really so successful as it was. But again, both of them were for basically the same reason. There was a third crusade that took place in Languedoc, in southern France. That's the different story, Languedoc. Danny, I see you're shaking your head. I guess you know a little bit of European history.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Interesting time frame. Interesting time frame.
I'm very interested in history. I find history extremely important. History is extremely important to understand many, many, many issues that come up. And if you know history, at least even the basic outlines of history, it's very helpful. When I was preparing for this, in my historical knowledge, I said, 1 second, for example, the Seljuks, the 11th century, what happened in the 11th century was so important. I mean, I knew different things. So, that's when the Seljuk Turks came, and that changed the whole situation. Just like later we're going to find the Ottoman Empire changes the whole situation, the whole thing, what's going on. The Shadransim changed the situation, basically Babylon collapsed and everything went to other places. So it's very important to understand the history, especially because we actually see these things affecting directly the quality and also where Jewish centers of learning are going to be. So, for example, North Africa disappears after Almohads, moves to Spain. In Spain, the Reconquista is going on. Okay, so what we find is in the earlier parts, the Spanish rabbis of note were living in Muslim Spain, and the later ones we'll find are living now in areas that were now taken over from Christian Spain, and Muslim Spain it actually collapses. There's no big people in Muslim Spain. Okay, that's the story, and that's because that's around the instance of the Reconquista. Now, in Christian Spain, it wasn't always good. Okay, once we get around to the 14th century, things start to really they weren't good in the beginning, but they really start going downhill very quickly. First, there's the Spanish Civil War, 1369 to 1370, 71. Two brothers, Henry and I think Peter it was. Can't remember what exactly. But anyways, during that time, many Jews were slaughtered. The Jews backed the wrong side in that, I guess. So that was one of the things that started the beginning of the very serious downfall in there. Although it must be admitted that the church in the Middle Ages was not very friendly to Jews. They were forced sermons in Jewish places where they were forced debates and stuff like that happened during those times. The next historical event of extreme importance, and this really starts at the end of the 14th century, leading into the 15th century, in 1391, in Spain, a Catholic priest got mobs to go to various Jewish towns with forced conversions and slaughters and everything. It was very famous in 1391. That started what many Jews would convert outwardly and not inwardly. Not know there are many Jews who actually converted to Christianity and became, very bitter anti-Semites. It's a history that's not talked about much. It doesn't relate to what we're talking about here, but many of the opponents in these debates were actually Jews who converted to Christianity. This has to do with Spanish history. I'm not giving history lessons. There's a number of interesting books on it. But in 1391 was really the beginning of the end. Forced conversions, forced sermons, forced debates was the rule, not the exception. And basically, with the Marranos presented a problem because they were trying to be Jewish privately in that, and so the Jewish community supported them. And so that was something, again, historically, we see that's a problem. Okay? So again, in the end, what happened in 1492 in Spain and 1496 in Portugal, the Jews were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, and there were no Jews in the Iberian Peninsula until, I don't know, recent days. I don't think there were Jews before that. Very sadly, the story in the Jews from Spain, many of them fled completely. Some went to Portugal because they were originally allowed in. Then the Portuguese king closed it. He kidnapped the children and forcibly converted them and expelled the adults. Story we know that, but the world doesn't talk about it too much. So that's a historical overview of Spain during the period of time we're going to talk about the Rishonim. So let's go through the rabbis that are important. There are a lot of things that are important to know. Again, in the beginning, there was some people there in Spain while the Goyim still were there. So, for example, Shmuel Noged was a leader there. He was he learned the Talmud. He was from 993 to 1055. After that, we have a number of different people who are important. Again, I'm not going to do the minor ones, but I'm going to try and do people you might have heard of. Shlomo ibn Gavriel was from 1021 to 1058. What makes him important is, first of all, he was a philosopher, well-known philosopher, and also he wrote a lot of religious poetry. And his poetry has become part of the liturgy among the Jews of the Sephardic Jews. So he's important. From 1050 to 1120 is a person who's somewhat important. His name is Bachya ibn Pakuda. The name Ibn should, of course, tell you that the person was living in Muslim Spain. Ibn means son of in Arabic. He wrote his book in Arabic. His work is called Choivas Levuos, The Duties of the Heart. A very, very, very key text, moralistic things. Ask Noah people actually, they have a copy of there from the that I put in our group about Shar HaBetuchen, to the gate of Betuchen, meaning the trust, which I really strongly recommend. I mean, if there's enough people who would like me to give a share on it, I might be able to be convinced to do it. It depends on how things work, but like most Jewish books, I mean, you could read it, but you really have to learn it together with somebody who is on the same way. But again, this is extremely important, especially Shar B'tuchen is very important, something for which applies to Noahides. Again, it's not a mitzvah of learning, but it's something that in practical for your life, it's something that will be very helpful. Okay, now we're going to go through some other people. Some you might have heard of, some I know you haven't heard of. There was a very big Talmud Chacham from 1077 to 1141. It's called the Rimagash. Gash is, I think, of a city, Yitzchak, I think was his name. Now, what makes him important is he was a teacher of the Rambam's father. Okay, so he's basically the Rambam's father's teacher, very important person. Around the same time, from 1080 to 1145, lived Yehuda Halevi. He wrote a very important work on philosophical work with Kuzari, which is basically defense of Judaism against the Muslims and the Christians, something that becomes very important. Remember, I mentioned Sadi Gun wrote a work on Noahides, which is the first theological work written. But from that time on, because of the interaction with Christianity and Islam, it becomes more important, and we'll see more and more, especially in Spain. Not in other places, but especially in Spain, we see works written about the Jewish faith, beliefs, why they are, in many ways, in contradiction to Christianity or Islam. Okay. Now, this work here, Kuzari was specifically written for that. It's a philosophical work. Been very influenced by his approach to that, in that his approach is based on tradition. How the Judaism has a tradition, nobody else has it, essentially. Okay, from 1089 to 1164 is the life of Abram Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra, of course, is somebody I think most of you might have heard. He's a very, very important Bible commentary. Among other things, philosophy and stuff like that, but mainly his importance is a Bible commentary. The Tanakh that you get will have that commentary. If you get an art school, you find Ibn Ezra constantly referred to. A very important person in biblical commentary. And then from 1135 to 1205 is the Rambam, Maimonides. The Rambam is going to be essentially the last major figure, in Muslim Spain. Okay, he is the last major figure here in Muslim Spain of any kind of stature whatsoever. All the ones later on are actually going to be Christians. Now, what's important, I remember the Almohads who invaded Spain. Okay, they were involved in forced conversions and persecutions of the Jewish people. This occurred while Maimonides was living there, and Maimonides actually fled the persecution to Egypt. Eventually, he was buried in Tiberias, in the Holy Land. You can visit his burial place. Actually, one of the things is that I've talked many times trying to see if we can organize a Noahide tour of Israel. One of the things we would do is go to Tiberias and visit where the Rambam is buried there. His father's also buried not very far from him in Tiberias. Visiting the grave sites of people sort of makes them a little bit more real. You pick up a book, it doesn't. But when you visit, it's like, hey, this guy died here, and this is where he's buried. So this guy was actually real. It's this is not the. It's not like Paul. Paul lived where he's buried. Maybe okay, we believe. But yeah, this guy's buried here. Okay, Rambam is buried here. So he went to, but it's an example of exactly what the problem was happening in Spain under the Muslims. The Muslim Spain basically collapses any kind of a center of Judaism, forced conversions, people fled from there. Okay, the Rambam ended up being there. So he was the last of the rabbis in Sephardic rabbis who lived in Muslim Spain. Following that, however, we have a number of rabbis of extreme importance. Many of those names you have heard. The next one from 1180 to 1263, but living in Barcelona in Christian Spain, is Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah is important. First of all, he was a Talmudist. Many commentaries, especially on Tractate of Brooklyn, is a very important commentary. But most importantly, to most people who have heard of him, because he wrote a very important moralistic work called Shari Tshuva. Shari Tshuva is the way I pronounce Shari Tshuva, the Gate of Repentance. It's a classical text on it. Part of the problem is for Noahides is that most is talking about with Jews. If you violate this commandment, so it's very you might find it interesting reading, but it doesn't. It's not really mostly practical. Although there are some issues that he brings up which are of course practical for Noahides. Certainly, but it's not practical. But it is a text which is fundamental. Has a long history. Around the same time, also from 1194 to 1270, also living in the same kingdom there, was the Ramban, Nachmanides. Nachmanides is one of the primary commentaries on the Talmud that we have. And remember, when we talk about our legal tradition, what happens is eventually everything goes back to the Talmud. Even the Rifta take it out, comes back. So a commentary on the Talmud explaining what it is, if it's an explanation of something the Talmud said the law goes that way, that becomes very important because it gives us a much clearer understanding of exactly what the Talmud is saying, so that it is reflected in the legal text later on. That's how the Talmud becomes very important that way also. Because so the Ramban lived from that time. Of course, his commentary on the Bible and on the Torah is very important. His was the first commentary on the Torah, which actually brought in Kabbalistic ideas. Kabbalah has been around the whole time. It was a secret learning. Only people, would learn from privately. It was never public as far as that was concerned. And Ramban was actually the first one who brought in ideas from Kabbalah in his actual commentary. So we see it, hinted at in very many places. There's like commentaries on the Ramban that talks about it. I have a Kabbalistic commentary on it from Imam Pafish. We'll mention him sometime later, who wrote a commentary on the Ramban, where he points out which Kabbalistic idea he's trying to talk about, which might be missed by the person reading it. So the Ramban is the first one. That very important commentary, very, very nice and scholarly. Okay, following that, we have a number of rabbis here who are important for different reasons. From 1235 to 1310 is the Rashba. The Rashba is a commentary on the Talmud, and also he wrote the Responsa. But his is one of the primary commentaries on the Talmud from the time of the Rishonim. Okay, it's a very nice commentary. The commentaries of the Rishonim are very beautiful. They elucidate in clear, succinct, and short language the meanings of texts, make it much easier to understand what's going on. The Rashba is one of the two that are about the same. Now, but at the same time, there's another one, which is, I actually like it more, is the Ritva. He was from 1240 to 1320. The Ritva's commentary is also very succinct, very short, but very clear, elucidating the text. It's from the Rishonim. It's really one of my favorites. I love learning him because he's just so clear and elucidating what it is. And again, that's important when you're trying to understand what is the text talking about. So when we're talking about the law, it's very important. Okay. At the same time, there was a work written called Sefer Chinuch. Now, some believe, and that's the standard way of something, it was written by somebody named Aaron Levi. He lived from 1215 to 1283. Some people say somebody else who lived from 1230 to 1300. The importance of Sefer Chinuch is like this. One of the works of the Rambam was Sefer Mitzvahs. And he wrote about the mitzvahs in the Torah. But he didn't write it in a real clear order. Okay? The Sefer Chinuch takes the mitzvahs essentially from the Rambam and puts us in the portion of the week. So in this portion, there's one mitzvah. This portion is one. What also makes it important, and this is what makes it significant for Noahides, there's a very, very important commentary. We're going to get up to this rabbi much later on, from an Achron, called Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch is a commentary on the Sefer Chinuch, where he goes through it very extensively. And within it, he talks constantly about if this applies, how this applies to a Noahide, when it applies, if it applies. So, for example, the first commandment is talking about, we'll get to this later, we'll talk about being fruitful and multiply. And he points out that that doesn't apply to Noahides, and he talks about that. So it's very important, it's a very, a text for somebody, if you want to know somebody, know something. If he talks about the Minchas Chinuch, then this rabbi knows what he's talking about. Okay, it's not just he picked up if you see him sometimes talking that he saw Minchas Chinuch, it's a way of understanding that this guy's somebody that actually spent time learning it. Just and if you look at the Divine Code, I'm sure he brings Minchas Chinuch many, many times down there. Okay, it's a sim. But again, this is written a commentary on this 13th century work of Sefer Chinuch. Okay, and this is learned by people learn it by themselves, by itself. But it's more common nowadays to use a Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas just explains, exactly. Like he'll say, something about eating matzah and Passover. It talks about eating matzah. This is the way we do it. And the Minchas Chinuch will talk about all the halachas, laws that have to apply to it. Okay. After that, there's Bachia ben Asher. He is, I think he was a Talmud Ramban. He has a wonderful commentary on the Tanakh, on the Torah itself. Very, very difficult, but his is openly Kabbalistic. On every verse, he gives it a simple meaning, sometimes it being a medrash meaning, and then he'll have a section, according to the Kabbalah, this is what it means. So it's again, what we're seeing at this time also is something that was happening. Philosophy had taken over a lot. The Rambam was philosophy, but as time went on, there was a turn against philosophy for a number of reasons. Many of the people who converted to Christianity were actually philosophers, specifically Aristotelian philosophers. And because of that, it weakened their ties to Torah, and many of them just converted to Christianity. Many of them, again, this is another story. I was giving a counter-missionary thing and talk about Spain and that I would actually mention. But what happened is that philosophy went out. There were decrees against learning philosophy unless you were 25. And in general, philosophy basically is on its way out. It's not that there weren't some philosophical works due specifically to our faith and stuff like that. It's just basically the only places we find it is in Spain. And even there, it's dropping out. And in fact, Kabbalistic things are becoming more common. Many more Kabbalistic things become more common. So Bachia ben Asher wrote his work, the Bainim B'chaya, it's called. And that's a very interesting work. I have it here. It's very interesting commentary. Now, as far as Sephardic halacha, the next person is David Abadraham. From 1060 to 1340, he wrote a work which called, strangely enough, the Abadraham, after his last name. And that's what it's called. And it's basically a work on halacha, more influential again in Sephardic lands than in Ashkenaz, because the Ashkenaz had different traditions, and we're going to get to some of those. Okay. Following that, we have a number of important rabbis in the halachic tradition. The first one, and maybe the most significant one here, is the Ran, right, Nissim? What's important about him is he wrote a commentary on the Rif. Remember we talked about the Rif beforehand. He's from North Africa, and he took together Talmud into the legal things. The Rif the Ran is a commentary on. He explains it, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes not, and he goes into much more in-depth explanations of that. When someone is learning, in order to know halacha, that's what you do. You go from the Talmud, you go to the Rif and the Ron is one of those things you look at. We're going to get to some other people whose names are also important. The Rambam is another one who's important for it, and we're going to get to some other ones who are also important. Okay, so that's him. The next one is Rabbi Vidal, and his important. He lived from 1300 to 1370. His important work is the Maggid Mishnah, commentary of the Rambam. There were many commentaries written on the Rambam because in the Sephardic world, the Rambam was extremely important. And because of that, he had a lot of commentaries on him. And that's the Rambam's influence continues at it. And now these commentaries, many of them disagreed, many agreed. It's not, but there's a commentary, Maggid Mishnah is one of the main commentaries. Another commentary on the Rif comes up by Yosef Barcelona. His is called the Mika Yosef. He lived from 1340 to 1400. His is the second primary commentary on the Rif. So when you learn the Rif, there's two commentaries you look at. You look at the Ran and you look at the Mika Yosef. And those you learn in order to learn the Rif, understand what he's trying to say, and to bring it together, understand the halachic implications of what you're learning. Okay? And you think learning halacha is so easy. It's not, if you want to do it right, it really involves a lot of intricate learning and seeing how these people from previous generations understood things so that you can put it together and understand it correctly. Okay? After that, we have two more people basically ending the Sephardic experience before those people who were in the exile, who were exiled from Spain. These people wrote two more philosophical works, but fundamentally based on explaining the fundamentals of Jewish faith. The first one was by Chasdei Kreskes. He lived from 1340 to 1415. He wrote things in the Talmud, but his main work was Or Hashem, which is a philosophical work. Now, he also wrote a work against Christianity. It's been translated into English. It's called The Refutation of Christian Principles, something like that. I've seen it in English. In Hebrew, it's a very small text, but he wrote. Okay. Again, as I pointed out to you, at this time, there's a lot of issues going on with forced conversions, with forced debates, with forced hearing of sermons. And so these books written to strengthen people were basically in order to strengthen people against Christianity, which is trying to push its control. Okay, and the last one, which is much more well known, I'm not saying it's better, but it's much more well known, and that was from Yosef Alboy. He lived from 1380 to 1444, and it's called Sefer HaIkrim. Ikrim means the book of fundamentals. That has on itself also has a number of commentaries. That is a work that people sometimes still learn today. He basically somewhat disagrees with Rambam with how many fundamentals. He says there's 3. The Rambam says there's 13, but he says that there's things that they're related. So he doesn't say there's nothing that the Rambam says you're required to read to believe that he doesn't say you're required to believe. But he talks about it in different levels, not as being fundamental, but derivative. So that's basically the end of the Spanish experience. After this, we're going to get to the exile from Spain. I'm going to talk about in the 15th century a few people who were from Spain who were exiles, who are of some importance. But essentially, that's really the end of Spain as any kind of force within Judaism. But the name Sfarad, which meant Spain, kept. And so all the Jews in those lands, which were Muslim lands, which were had under Muslim, we call them Sephardim. Okay, but again, the traditions will come basically from the Rif, the Rambam, from those, and that's which causes it. We're going to turn now to Germany. I'm going to take a break and take some questions, but that's where their traditions come from. Okay, let me take a break for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to go to basically Germany, France, England, which is the basics of Ashkenaz. So if there's any questions, I will entertain them. Don't feel bad. Last night I didn't have too many questions because basically this is mostly a history lecture, and we're not bringing in too many ideas. It's mostly just facts and figures to get you a feel that, again, the tradition is going to generation to generation to generation to generation, going down until our present day. It's not broken. Even when we have, problems that happen, there's always been a continuation of these traditions. Okay.
Maybe I have one question, Rabbi. So I understood from the last session that the center for halachic decisions was in Jerusalem, and after it goes to Babylonia, and now on, the first time from the Rishonim was it in Spain? So
okay, what happens like this is after the fall of the yeshivas, there was never a central yeshiva. What there was is areas in which there would be various yeshivas, various things in there. We'd have various leaders of those areas. Okay, so we didn't have a central yeshiva. It was more decentralized. Which, if you look at historically what was going on, that was very, very helpful, because they no longer had the kind of stability you had in Babylonia. You didn't have, from 4 or 5 centuries of stability in any one place. Even with changes of government, there was no longer any kind of stability whatsoever. Okay, so what happens is, for example, in Spain, there was instability. What happened is some countries were under Muslims, then came the Almohads, and they had to flee. But then the Reconquista, they populated again. But again, there was always the persecution. So you had different leaders in different generations. They always existed. There were yeshivas in Barcelona. Was a very important place, for example. Girona is also another place. Rabbi Reni was from Girona. I think it's part of Castile. I think it ends up being part of Castile or Aragon. I think was named the kingdom there. But anyways, the point is that rather than having a real central, as in location central, we now have central in the sense that there's a region that is fundamentally pretty much the same. Okay, fundamentally. Now these get broken up later on. So, like for example, Sephardim, you'll have Syrian Jews, Iranian Jews, Iraqi Jews, similar, but not really the same anymore. It starts breaking up. We're seeing a decentralization again, all following the same principles. We have from the top, we have our judges, our rabbis in our area, and we follow them. It's just because there's no centrality, it's more broken down. So the judges become judges of smaller areas. Yeah. Now it's Europe. Now it's here. So Europe is pretty much a thing. But we see as time goes on, local customs, even in Europe, start developing. Okay.
This is so the key element, or the key start, the key beginning of spreading, or
it's not so much of spreading or decentralization of Torah. Okay. Again, same system, same type of system, but rather than having, there's no higher court. There's like a certain level, but there's no higher court to go over that ever could. When there were yeshivas in Babylonia, you could always go to them as the court of last resource. Okay, that no longer existed. Okay, so you have, certain rabbis have certain levels, whatever they would be going, but you no longer have that. And again, things become more and more broken up as time goes on because of different various factors causing it. So you'll end up having, for example, when we get to the late, you have customs in Germany, which are different from the customs in Jews in Poland, even though the center will end up being in Poland rather than in Germany anymore. So German Jews had certain customs. They have different. We have all kinds of things of that nature.
Okay. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. Okay. Now let's continue. We're going to talk about basically Ashkenaz, which Germany, which actually wasn't Germany then, it was a Holy Roman Empire, and France and England especially. We'll take some other areas separately, but basically that's the main sense. Now, remember I mentioned last time that under Charlemagne, he took from the Colonus family in Italy and settled them. There were big rabbis, big learned people in the city of Mainz, where influence, and that really is the source of the learning that comes there. So remember the City of Minds because it's going to have a very sad history to it. Okay, so let's discuss, before we go into specific rabbis, we want to do an overview of the history of Jews in Christian Europe, which sadly to say is, I could probably give a class for a number of weeks going through things specifically, so I'm going to have to give you a very quick overview in things. There are a number of significant event classifications. So let's discuss about pogroms and the Crusades first. That's the most remembered by people as far as in Jewish experience in Europe, although there were many other things, as we'll see, that happened. But the Crusades and the pogroms that occurred were off and on and very devastating. The First Crusade was in 1096. And essentially what happened is the Crusaders went through the Rhine and the Danube, and they attacked Jewish communities and destroyed them, tried to force conversions, destroy them. So in the empire, there were three main communities of the Jewish people which were there. There was Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. I don't know what the real German names are, but they come in from pretty close to that probably, since in Yiddish that's what the names are. It's not so much different. And these were three communities. During the 1096 Crusade, the Crusaders went through and virtually wiped out all these communities, slaughtered people, to the point that nowadays we actually say special prayers during the time between Passover and Shavuos. There are people each Shabbos who say certain prayers, certain types of things in remembrance of the destructions of these communities. That's how serious it was. Okay. Also, by the way, there was in England also at the same time a very famous incident in York where they attacked the Jews in York. The Jews in York fled to a tower. I don't remember who it was, the local bishop or something like that. And basically, they were breaking in. So all the Jews killed first their children and then themselves, rather than that they should be subject to conversion. And in fact, I know somebody who was from England, and he told me that there was a prohibition to spend the night in York from that time on. So that was the First Crusade. The Second Crusade in 1147 was basically for France. That's where most of the problems happened. 1188 was also in France. In 1295, there was a pogrom in many cities in Germany, in the empire, called the Rindfleisch pogrom. Not sure what the Rindfleisch is. I believe was the name of the person who actually did it. It's unclear on the sources. They went through many cities. I will mention it again because one of the most important rabbis of that time was killed during this pogrom. Finally, there was the last crusade of importance was the Shepherd's Crusade in 1320, which again went through communities that were in France and ravaged those communities. Now, besides the pogroms, there were also expulsions, exiles from the lands. Okay, for example, in England in 1240 there was a temporary expulsion, but in 1290 under King Edward I, the Jews were expelled from Spain and were not allowed back in until Cromwell. Treated about 300 years, I think it is, almost 300 years later. Okay, France was, of course, basically a revolving door. Okay, so in 1254, Louis IX sent them out, but eventually let them back in. What was happening is basically the kings would borrow money from the Jewish community. It would be taxed, they'd borrow money. It would be a loan. And when the king realized he couldn't pay it back, he nullified the loan and threw the Jews out. So Edward I, that's what he did. And the kings of France, they did the same thing also. So Louis IX threw them out, but when it was, and the first one actually occurred in 1182 under Philip Augustus, same reason, they didn't have money. But then, of course, they called him back in. So Louis IX ran up his debt too much. So in 1254, Between 1304 and 1394, there were a number of them. I think a couple of Charleses, a Henry or so was thrown in there. Anyways, the story is basically the same. France was not a very, favorable place for the Jewish people, even though Rashi had lived in France, what had been France, but by that time it was no longer friendly. In the 15th century, there were a number of expulsions from German cities. In 1496, many of the German cities throughout the Jewish people who were there. And much of these expulsions led to basically the Jewish people moving to the east. Okay? The West was being unfriendly, uninhabitable basically for Jews. So the Jews moved to the east. There would still be some Jews in places like Germany and stuff like that. But basically, the east is where they went to. What places will become Poland, and we're going to get up to that soon. But essentially, that's what's happening with these expulsions, is the eastward movement. Also in Spain, which I didn't mention because it wasn't really a riot at the time, but in 1242, there was a trial in Paris. The Talmud was put on trial by the church. It was, of course, obviously judged to be guilty. Like as if there was a question in the first whether that was what it was supposed to be. And they gathered all the Talmuds that were in Paris and burnt them. That's in 1242. We still say now on Tisha B'Av, there's a special kinna, I don't know what the translation of kinna is in English, a prayer for, a mourning type of prayer about this burning of the Talmud in Paris in 1242. Jews don't forget. We have a very long memory. Okay, so that happened. Another event which had an effect on Jewish lives was the Black Death from 1346 to 1353. Okay, the Jewish communities, because the Jews were basically cleaner, didn't have the problem with the rats as much as other places that were much cleaner. The Christian neighbors accused the Jews of poisoning wells, and this led to persecutions and trials and people being executed. Now, the most famous, of course, thing in the Middle Ages, as far as accusation of Jews, is the blood libel. The first blood libel, I'm not going to mention too much about many of them, because there were quite a few of them. But the first one that we know of was in 1144 in Norwich. I can't remember the boy's name, but he was sainted. After all, being killed for Jews for your blood makes you that's a sainting event. There were miracles that happened because of him, so he became a saint. And Jews lost their life for it. The first one's 1144, but after that, there were a number in England and Gloucester in 1168, and 1181 in Bury St. Edmunds, and in Bristol in 1183. France in Blois, which at that time, remember, France was under the English king. So when we talk about France, Blois was I think Stephen of Blois his wife was Matilda, and he became king of England for a short amount of time. So it's understood that when we talk about France, they're really talking about England also. Germany got itself in 1235 in a city called Fulda. I don't know where Fulda is, but they got their licks in also, the Germans, can't leave the Germans out. Then in Lincoln in 1255, a boy named Hugh, Saint Hugh, he got sainted. It's a very easy way to sainthood, be accused of being killed by a Jew. So he was that. Germany, there were a number of them at that in Alsace, in Oberwiesel, and in Trent in 1475. I can't remember the boy's name, but he was also sainted. So we see basically the whole period of time that we're talking about to 1440, from 1040, that whole period of that 400 period of time in Ashkenaz, in this area of Europe, was basically subject to pogroms from the Crusades and the pogroms, expulsions, all kinds of murders and persecutions from the church. And through it all, we'll see that we have continued from generation to generation. We still had rabbis who were able to teach, learn of a great level, and still keep that under level until, of course, the events, and things basically collapsed there. So let's go through some of the pieces. Many of these names you'll be familiar with, some not. The ones that you're not familiar with, I'm just mentioning because of their importance. The first one is from 960 to 1040. It was Rabbeinu Gershom. Now that's the same time that the Chai Gaon lived. So we have Rabbeinu Gershom, again, a big rabbi at the same time, who's basically the foundation for German Jewry. Now, Rabbeinu Gershom is well known for a number of reasons, one of which is that he came out with various tikkunas, various decrees for the Jewish people. One of them is that a man's not supposed to have two wives. In Sephardic lands, that was never forbidden. In fact, in Islamic lands, you're allowed to have more than one wife. So Sephardic lands, people could have more than one wife. There's no biblical prohibition of that whatsoever. It's not prohibited, it's allowed. But he came against it. He also came out with a excommunication for somebody who reads somebody else's mail. It's a very famous thing that came down to us. Shouldn't be reading other people's mail. Doesn't say specifically you're not allowed to do it, but he says that as one of the tikkunas is that not allowed to read it. You shouldn't read other people's mail. Okay. Other things. He is the start of the German the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, and in fact, these things begin to essentially cause a separation between Jews from Ashkenaz from Jews from Sephardim. Okay. After that, we have an important rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, who was a Talmudist, but he's more important because he was a teacher of Rashi. He was Rashi's teacher. Now, he lived from 1040 to 1105. Excuse me. He died around 1055, excuse me. Rashi lived from 1040 to 1105. So Rabbi Eliezer was his teacher when he was younger, but of course Rashi became the great Rashi. I mean, Judaism doesn't exist whether you're in from Ashkenaz Sephardim. Judaism doesn't exist without Rashi, whether it be commentaries on the Talmud, his very succinct and important Talmud commentary. Again, like Rishon, he explains it clearly and distinctly what's going on. His halacha, there are responsive from him, and we get from a work I mentioned, second Machzavitcher, from his halachas, and his biblical commentary on the Tanakh. He has a commentary on all of Tanakh, fundamental to understanding. Rashi is the biggest figure in Europe as far as Jewish learning from then on. Okay, after that, important is in 1105, Rabbi Simcha of Vitry. Vitry is, I believe, was in France at that time. He wrote a work called Machzor Vitry. I have it here. It's 2 volumes. It's about the prayers that were customary and also about the laws. So it's basically the first compendium of the laws of the Jews living in the lands of Ashkenaz. Okay? Following Rashi, his students and their students came to be called the Balei Tosfos. Tosfos means additions, because what they did is they went through the Talmud and Rashi's commentary, and they wrote additions. They wrote commentaries on it. The Tosfos usually starts off with there's a question. Sometimes it's just an explanation, but here's a question. Rashi says here this, another place Rashi says this. It seems to contradict. What's the answer? Then it says this rabbi says this rabbi says this rabbi says this. That's what Tosfos looks like. Some of them are short, some are very long. The longer ones are actually easier. The shorter ones are really hard, trying to figure out what he's trying to say. But essentially, that's what it is. And Tosfos, again, these are very important. We talk about halacha with Tosfos and Rashi, is because when you're dealing with a passage in the Talmud that is the halacha, that we bring it down, Rashi and Tosfos explain it and explain some difficulties that might be it, so we can understand clearly when we're talking about what the law is, exactly how it is. And you've seen me mention a few times with some passages with Rashi and Tosfos, what they say, because they give us understandings of what these things mean. Okay. Now, there are many different people from the Balei Tosfos. I will mention some of them. The first 2 I'm going to mention are actually grandsons of Rashi. The first one is Rashbam. Rashi only had daughters. So we talk about grandsons, not sons. His grandson, Rashbam wrote a commentary on the Talmud. In fact, one of the tractates, Pesachim, has his commentary in place of Rashi, where Rashi didn't write. I think in place of it, in addition, very succinct. Rashbam also has a commentary on the Torah, which appears in addition to Rashi. His commentary is very similar to his grandfather, except it's much more on the simple meaning. Okay, Rashi will occasionally, veer around and say there's this medrash. He brings a medrash into to discuss an issue there, but the Rashbam is only on the simple meaning. Never gets into anything else about that. Then there's, of course, Rebbeinu Tam. Rebbeinu Tam is extremely important for halacha and the Torah. There are many places where we'll see discussions of things, and it'll be discussion whether we follow Rebbeinu Tam's view of the Talmud or for another view of the Talmud. There's a famous, there's a lot of Jews who wear two pairs of tefillin, for example. One is called the tefillin of Rebbeinu Tam because it has to do with how the parshas, the different, how it's supposed to appear, the different, things are appearing to it. So Rebbeinu Tam is extremely important. The next three are just three I took out somewhat at random, but not really so much at random. From France, Yehuda Serlion, he lived from 1166 to 1224. Yechiel of Paris from 1190 to 1268. Yechiel from Paris took part in the disputation about the Talmud. And he's one of the important Tosfos. A lot of times you'll see in Tosfos says, I'm the E. The Re says, Rabbi Yitzchak says that's Re from the Paris. Okay? The last one's Rabbinic Peretz. Rabbinic Peretz is a collection of Tosfos from Rabbinic Peretz, a very important collection of people. Again, these are commentaries on the Talmud. They come into our halachic process when they are commentaries on a specific passage, which, it's where we see what the final halacha is. Not so much the arguments there, but when we have the final halacha, what it is, looking at that and how they understand what the Talmud means, affects on how we understand what the halacha is going to be. Now, a couple of people. First is, we mentioned the York Massacre. In the York Massacre, Rabbi Yom Tov of Joigny, I don't know, I can't pronounce the French city, whatever, was in York at the time, and he was among those who were slaughtered there. It was a big, he's considered also from the Baal Tosfos, but he was there at the time. There was also a very important Bible commentary from 1060 to 1135. Mostly we see this on the Nach, Yosef Kara, not to be confused with Yosef Kara from Shulchan Aruch fame. Yosef Kara has a commentary on the Nach. You see it in Mikras Gedolos, printed there also. A very, common type of commentary explaining what it is. Now, in Germany, in around those three cities, in the 12th century, early 13th century, there was a group of people called Hasidic Ashkenaz. This was a type of Muslim movement there. Very, very, very influential in the customs of Ashkenaz and the halachas with regards to it. It was founded from Shmuel ben Kalonymus, from the famous Kalonymus family, which was that family that Charlemagne brought into from Italy to Germany and settled mines from that family. They lived I think he lived in Speyer, if I remember correctly. Okay. Now his son, he wrote religious poetry. We actually say Yom Kippur, his poetry, very moving. His son was Yehuda Achusad, who wrote the work Sefer Hasidim. This work is very fundamental in Ashkenaz. It's filled with customs and Jewish laws. Among the things, for example, he wrote things that a person should not marry somebody. His father-in-law should not have his same name as his, for example, and a woman should not have the same name as her mother-in-law. A number of other things that he brought, which became customary. These are based on, they were Kabbalists also, but they're not openly about such things about Kabbalah, as in Spartan it became later on. Very important. My wife actually is descendant from Rabbi Yehuda Achusad, and the other Sefer Hasidim. So it's very important in Ashkenaz as far as that's concerned. Okay? One of his main Talmud was, Elazar Rakeach. He wrote the words Rakeach, which is a moralistic work, similar to the lines of Sefer Hasidim, not as well known. But again, this was that movement, Hasidic Ashkenaz. that's very important and very influential into the moral life, into the halachic life, of the Jews living in that area. Now let's get back to some of the halachic stuff that was going on. At the time, remember, there was no central thing. There wasn't, like the Rambam had Mishnah Torah, but that was mostly, part of it had to be Sephardic custom. In Europe, there were different rabbis who wrote works. So, for example, the next one, Yitzchak Orzua, Ozri is how I pronounce Orzua, from 1200 to 1260. He lived in Germany, and he wrote a work on law, halacha, and just explaining what the halachas are. This becomes more important later on when we get to Shulchan Aruch, the Torah and Shulchan Aruch later on. We'll come up with that again, but again, these are setting up what the halacha did, what the legal custom was, which way to follow there, the minhag. Following that time, around the same time as Moshe Kusi, I believe he was also involved in events that occurred within the Kusi is there. And he wrote an important work called the Smog. Smog stands for Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. It's a compendium of the mitzvahs of the Torah. Similar concepts to the Rambam, but he has some differences that he disagreed with him. Very influential work. Remember, a book on the mitzvahs is actually telling what you're supposed to be doing. So it is, in a sense, a halachic work, but much not as specific as some of the other works we have here. Likewise, around the time was Rabbi Yitzchak Kobil, who wrote Smak, which is Sefer Mitzvahs Kotanu. It's called the smaller one. Now, at this time, there were two people that are important because they were persecuted. One is Meyer of Rothenburg, Aram Rothenburg. He lived in the city of Rothenburg in Germany, very important city at the time. I don't know how important it is today, but Rothenburg was a very important city there. And so he was very influential among German Jews at the time. He was kidnapped by a local duke, I think he was, and interred in a castle. And the Jewish community was asked to pay money to ransom him. And he told the community they should not pay money for him. He did not want the dukes and stuff like that to get used to the idea of, kidnapping rabbis for ransom money. They already were having enough problems with it. They didn't need another reason to get, money like that. So he was there. He actually died in prison. Sometime later, somebody ransomed him out to be buried and given the Jewish burial. But he's not known for that. The story is about what happened. He was known because his Maram at Rothenburg was one of the most important halachic and Talmudic people from the time. The other one is Mordechai ben Hillel. Mordechai ben Hillel was murdered during the Rindfleisch massacres in 1298. The Mordechai is a very fundamental commentary in the Talmud for halacha. When I learned in Koil, for example, for halacha, we looked at that after we looked at another commentary we call the Rush. He brings there the halacha as it was known in Germany, in Ashkenaz. And he was murdered, one of the many, many rabbis who ended up being murdered during these things. Now, the next two more than the third, are fundamental to not just Judaism in Ashkenaz, but Judaism all over the world. Okay? The first one is Rabbani Osher ben Yechiel, but his work is called the Rash. What it is a commentary on the Talmud, and he goes through the Talmud page by page, and he brings out halachic discussions on every single issue that's there. Okay? Now, he was from Ashkenaz. He ended up, because of the persecutions in Germany, he fled to Spain at the end, but he is still from his customs is from Ashkenaz, as are his son, who's as important, if not in some ways. It's very hard to say which one's more, but the Rosh, and so he all the Talmud. You go in the back of the Talmuds now, you see it's called the Rosh, and that is the halacha. In fact, one rabbi said that you should learn the Talmud with the Rosh because it teaches you what the halacha is. And of course, when you're learning for halacha, again, when I went to Koil, the Rosh was fundamental. you learned what he had to say because he explained the halacha as it came down, and basically you got most of what he said. Now his son was, in a sense, in a practice, much more important. He wrote a type called, he's called the Bahaturim. He wrote a work called the Abaturim, that means the four columns. Okay, he divided into four sections: or Chaim, which deals with everyday life; Yeridaya, which deals with things that you have to kosher laws and certain laws that rabbis have to know; Even Ezra, family law, marriage, divorce, and things like that; and Choshen Mishpat is the laws of business. Our Shulchan Aruch takes its format and even the chapters directly from the Torah. Okay. Now, this was a fundamental work, and it's phenomenal to look at. What he does is, first of all, he divides it in a very clear, logical form. The Mishnah Torah is divided in a different way. You can find these, but this is in clear, logical form. So if you want to know what daily stuff is, or Chaim, you go through everything there. And also what he did is, well, the Mishnah Torah deals a lot of it with sacrifices, which we don't deal with today. Or the Torah deals only with those laws that are relevant for us today. Okay. Now, what he does is he has each section, and he'll discuss it. Nowadays, they actually divide up in paragraphs. You can see from paragraph how the Shulchan Aruch is actually based on the paragraphs that were in the Torah, where he brings it. But so he'll bring a different law, and he'll bring various opinions as far as what it is. Now, the Torah itself generated a number of commentaries, and I'm going to mention some of those there. It was of such importance until the Shulchan Aruch came around. It was the book of halacha. It's what people looked at because it brought it, and the commentaries helped to bring it up to date. But that's how important it was. Okay, so the last rabbi in Ashkelon I want to talk about is the Maril. He lived from 1365 to 1427. He's important because he wrote a book on the customs and halacha in Ashkenaz. That is basic minhagi Ashkenaz. Most of the customs from Ashkelon basically go back to his work. Okay, that's where it comes from. And the later authors draw from him when they have commentaries on the Torah or on the Shulchan Aruch. They draw from him as that's where our customs come from, the people from Ashkenaz, where difference been spotted. Now, I'm going to take a 2-minute break.
My health service isn't that great.
1 second.
When you're
Okay. What? Veronica, I couldn't hear a word you said.
when you're talking about okay, write it down.
You're breaking up. Is she breaking up for everybody or just for me?
Everybody, and she's muted. It's muted now, so I don't know if she muted it or it just did it itself.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe she can type out her question.
Yeah, Veronica, do you want to type your question if you can? Then we can. Okay. I guess I'll continue. She types out a question. I'll try and put it in. So let's continue with, there are 2 more areas we want to deal with. One is Provence. Provence is like Ashkenaz and like Sephard. It's like, it was in between. Okay. So again, important to understand the 10th century, 1000s, the early 11th century, there was, of course, someone there called Moshe Darshan. He's mentioned in Rashi very many times in his commentary. Also important there, and We have the Ravid from 1120 to 1197. He's important because there's a commentary on the Mishnah Torah that he has. If you look at the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam will say something, and many times you see at the side, it'll say Aleph Avram Omer. That's the Ravid in his commentaries on the Mishnah Torah. Okay, Veronica, I'll answer your question shortly. Let me finish with this. Then another person, again, a commentary on the Rambam's Sefer Mitzvahs is Zachia Halevi. He wrote Sefer Hamor, which is a commentary on that. He was from 1125, 1186. Another person I think most people might have heard of is David Kimchi. He's from 1160 to 1235. He wrote a commentary on Tanakh. It's called the Radak. Radak is one of the nicest commentaries on Tanakh there is. I love it. It's a beautiful commentary, very, very clear in his commentary, in his explanations. The next person is somebody who's pretty well known, but was not known until recently. That's Menachem Meiri. He lived from 1249 to 1306. He wrote a commentary on the Talmud, but that commentary was unknown until the 20th century, essentially. That creates a problem that as a commentary in the Talmud, it's not an issue. As a commentary in Halacha, it becomes a problem because whether we're talking about Rashi, the Tosfos, Rambam, everybody, they're all subject to a halachic process of criticism. Okay? If somebody says something, this person critiques it, and there's a criticism going back and forth. Somebody could Tosfos says something, so we'll say, comment on Tosfos, and these will go back and forth. This is kind of commentaries that, for example, the Chronim are very well known for. But these kind of commentaries, these kinds of back and forth, the Meiri was never subject to them. So although the Meiri is a Rishon, many people from later days will not rely on him as far as halacha is concerned. The Chazon Ish is probably one of the most famous ones, and Moshe Feinstein also, but Chazon Ish would not. Why? Because he was not subject to this type of criticism, and we don't feel we are of the level that we could criticize him. What he says stands. We're not going to criticize him, but we don't, because we don't have the ability to say, hey, you're disagreeing with this person, we're not on that level. He's a Rishon, we're an Acham, we don't. So because he was out of Acham, he's just not part of the process, so he's not part of the decision-making process. Chazon Ish, many others. This is important because of some things the Meiri says about Noahide laws that are not really halacha. We wouldn't paskin according to that, as far as a Jew wouldn't paskin for himself halacha that way. So there's no reason for a Noahide we should paskin that way. There's some very important. There's some things he says are very nice. They're interesting, and I think it's quite true. But again, it's not part of the halacha process. Okay, the last place I want to mention is Italy. Italy was also one of those between being Muslim and being that, because it's sort of in the middle. So there are a few people there that are of interest to know about. In the early period, right, of the Gaonim, there's Nassim ben Yechiel. He wrote a very important work called Sefer Orch. Sefer Orch is basically a dictionary. A dictionary in the sense that at the time, Aramaic at one time had been the spoken language of Jewish people. But after the fall of Babylon, people living in Germany, people living in Arabic lands, they didn't speak Aramaic anymore. And, well, maybe in Arabic is similar to it, but it's not. So he wrote the Sefer Orch. Sefer Orch is a dictionary of the Aramaic words in the Talmud that are difficult that people don't understand, and he explains them what they mean in Hebrew. Very important. I have it. It's very interesting. The next two people are very important because they wrote, their works are called Midrashim, but they're more similar to the kind of commentaries that we start to see with Rashi. Rashi is basically the first real type of extensive type of commentary, but it's very similar to Rashi. Okay, the first one is called Midrash Leikach Tov. It was written sometime in the late 11th and early 12th century by Tovia ben Eliezer. Okay, and the second one is Midrash Seichel Tov, was written by Menachem Shlomo somewhere in the 12th century. Similar formats, sometimes similar ideas. They're like commentaries, Midrashim, because it's a time we didn't have commentaries like we have now with Rashi. Once Rashi actually the first real type of commentary that tried to explain the text in a simple manner. Other times we didn't really. In general, it has to be understood. Jews don't really care about when they're going to. They don't really look at what's the simple meaning. They learn, they learn it for different things. Okay, so the word not real commentators really tried to concentrate on simple meaning. Rashi was really the first. His grandson, the Rashbam, improved on it, and the other commentators basically concentrate on the simple meanings of the text. Okay, and these, the Medrash Seichel Tov, Medrash Reichel Tov, they are very similar to Rashi in that most of what they say is really geared around what the simple meaning of the text is, even it's called the Medrash. Okay, another person of importance was in Menachem Akanti wrote a biblical commentary, not very well known here. The next one is Shibbolei Alekit, which was halachic compendium written in Italy. But Tzidkiyahu Haroife was a doctor, obviously, and Shibbolei Alekit was very important for the Jews in that period. Now, I will continue just a little bit, to give an introduction for the earlier Rishonim, the Achronim. Last night I got a little bit farther, but I'm not going to go much more than that, and more than this. I'm going to just get a little introduction to whet your appetite for what's going to be coming next. There's sort of the 15th century is sort of an inter period. So there are a couple of people I mentioned, but what happens in the around 1500 are two very important events. Number one, with the expulsion from Spain, where the Jews are going to go to, the Ottoman Empire opened itself up for Jewish immigration. The Jews many went from Spain to the Ottoman Empire. So that from then on, we're going to see when we get to the Chaim, the Ottoman Empire is going to be filled with important rabbis of the Achronim, which we haven't seen in hundreds of years. All of this is because the Ottoman Empire stabilized the area and allowed the Jews to come in and live in a stable life. Okay. The other thing was, in the year 1501, the King of Poland invited the Jews to come and settle Lithuania. Lithuania and Poland were pretty much the same country, with sometimes back and forth, but the King of Poland invited the Jews to come in. Now, at the time, remember, we were talking about how Jews were being expelled from Germany. Where did they go to? So, in English, in America, say, go west, young man. Well, for the Jews, it was actually go east, young man. They started going east. So you start seeing Jews in areas, the eastern part of the empire, Bohemia, Moravia, become more important places. Hungary, Slovakia. People start moving into areas like this slowly. Hungary at that time was still under the Ottoman Empire, I think. So, Poland, eventually Russia. So that Eastern Europe then starts becoming, for Ashkenaz, the center. It had been in Germany. Remember, Mainz had been the center, a little bit more spread out. But now, with the expulsions, we're moving east and into Poland. So my ancestors came from Poland. Okay, how did they get there? Because thrown out of Germany. Okay, and again, so what we have here going now is we have the movement of the center of gravity of Torah from Germany, France, that area, to Poland, and from Sephardim, the center of gravity having been in Spain, moving from there to the Ottoman Empire. Okay, that's what's going on. So last night I go a little bit further, but I'm going to, I think, just stop tonight with one thing. I want to go through the 15th century. Mention three people who were exiles from Spain, who ended up in different places. The first one, Yosef Yavitz. Yosef Yavitz wrote a number of works, one called Chaim, a number of works, philosophical, moralistic, whatever. He's very important because he talks about the expulsion from Spain. One of the things he mentions there, which is very important, we talked about philosophy earlier. One thing he mentions that when it came to being expelled from Spain, what was given, in 1491 says basically this: convert or leave. And he said that those who were philosophers converted. But those who were the simple people who essentially the Kabbalists or the simple people who were just simple served Hashem and followed the Torah without any philosophical speculations, they left. They picked up the bags and they left. Okay, they understand it was time to go. But the ones who were philosophical stayed. Okay, so he writes about that. Okay, I guess the Barbanel is a little bit of an exception because his worship, but Barbanel was also a little bit of a Kabbalist, although most people don't know it. He was actually a Kabbalist. So the other person I'm talking about here, and the next one is the Barbanel. He was from 1437 to 1508. I think he died in Italy. Certainly some of his books that he wrote, his commentaries, I think he wrote one of them that says he was in Italy when he wrote it. Okay, Dan Yitzchak Barbanel, from the famous Barbanel family. Barbanel was very, very famous. The Barbanel family actually descends from King David. So he wrote Bible commentaries and some philosophical, some philosophical. Basically, he's known for his Bible commentary, Tanakh and the Torah. Very deep philosophical type of approach. The third one I want to mention, Eliyahu Mizrahi. He was from 1450 to 1525. He wrote a commentary on Rashi. One of many commentaries on Rashi, but I think he's one of the earliest ones. Nowadays, there's many, many commentaries on Rashi. I have my bookcase here. A number of commentators, right, including him. People comment on Rashi to make it, because Rashi is not such a simple commentary. But he was one of those people who was exiled from Spain and went towards the east. Okay, so that's basically the ending of the 15th century. Now, the period of early Achronim technically starts from 1440 and goes to around 1800. But we're going to start about the year 1500, essentially. Okay, I'm going to do this next month. We'll leave it to there. I see how much time we're on because I'm going to finish that. Now, last night I was able to do more. So this time it took a bit longer. I guess I recognize certain things I should say. What we're going to do next time is we're going to continue to the period of Achronim, bring up to the 20th century, late 20th century. I don't know if I have anybody here who's actually for the 21st century, but certainly for the 20th century. And then the month after that, we're going to discuss the two main movements within Ashkenaz, which affects those people who are working with Noahides directly to them. That's the Yeshiva movement that comes out from the Vilna Gaon, and the Hasidic movement that comes out from the Baal Shem Tov. Okay, we're going to discuss them, a little bit of the history, where the yeshivas come from, Rosh Yeshivas, and with the Hasidic groups. I'll mention the Hasidic groups that are here today that are important, and we'll see where they go, how they go back to the Baal Shem Tov. And of course, you see where I come from. My group comes from in Galicia, whatever. But the point is that will once we finish these two, you'll pretty much know all about. First of all, you'll understand that, in fact, when we speak today, rabbis, they have a very long tradition of coming back to them. Okay? And you're going to want to, when you speak to a rabbi, ask him, he has to be somebody who understands that he comes from a chain of stuff. He's not just making this up on his own. He's not looking, the Bible says to do this. No, there's a whole thing like that. And that will eventually be enough of an introduction. We can talk about types of Jewish learning, and then, get down to the brass tacks of, who are people you should listen to? When you listen to somebody, does he know what he's talking about? Like if he says, I saw an interesting Minchas Chinuch on the issue, how Noahides aren't required to keep, be fruitful and multiple. If you see somebody talking like, it looks like that guy's actually learned something. Okay, he just didn't pick up a book and start going from there. He's spent some time to really delve into this, to have a good feeling. Which is important. So, okay, I think we will end there. Veronica did ask a question. I'd like to answer that because that's a very important question. Veronica's question is this: do new Jews choose to be Ashkenaz Sephardic, and how do they choose? Okay, that's very interesting because first of all, you have to understand, how does somebody become Ashkenaz Sephardic in the first place? It's because his ancestors came from there. Okay, you're basically born into it. What happens if one parent is one or the other? Basically, the halacha is you follow what your father is. But, so if you're not born into it, what happens if you convert? What I always tell is, listen, as a convert, you're like a newborn child that can choose whatever you want. So I always suggest, someone who converts is to go to different places. Some groups are not as welcoming as others. So, it's more of a problem. Like, for example, I know, the Syrian community does not do conversions. Now, if you converted and want to go to the Syrian community, that I'm not sure how that works. I'm not overly familiar with Sephardim. And even among for example, Hasidim the Hasidim are a very close community, except for Lubavitch. Every group has people that come in, but you're looked at a little bit more. We can discuss why that is, but it's, the simple reason is if you look at the way I look, I certainly look like I come from a different planet than you guys do. Okay? Seems like a spaceship just dropped me off here and you don't know where this guy came from. It's like a different world. And in fact, the Hasidic world in general, except for Lubavitch, is very much worldly. The Hasidic world is very, very much outside. Okay, very closed and not as much. So understanding that is very important. Okay, so again, I don't push conversion. You don't want to convert, that's fine. But somebody who does join, that's what it is. Now, when it comes to Noahides, these things should make a difference. Okay, you're looking for a rabbi who's knowledgeable, and what he comes from doesn't make a difference because you're not going to be a chassid and you're not going to be yeshivas. Okay, you're just going to follow what simple the laws are. These aren't relevant to Noahides. There's a Noahide law which doesn't. Now, the differences will come up when we talk about religion. We're going to talk about religion Noahides, is because our viewpoint on the world is we look at certain things very differently. Okay, the Muslim movement, for example, looks at things differently than the Hasidic movement is. Okay, the Hasidic movement is much more Kabbalistic. It's much more Kabbalistic ideas. There's certain different ways that we approach certain problems. Simple example. Hashem's hashkacha in this world. Hashem looks at everything in this world. So how detailed is it? Is it look at people in general? Is what? Okay. There's a story of the Baal Shem Tov. One time the Baal Shem Tov was in a wagon. He used to go with his wagon driver, was a non-Jew. And it was Talmidim who would go around and he would, use it as teaching opportunities. So he was on there and he tells his wagon driver, go outside to stop a second. And he goes down to the road and there's a leaf on the road and he lifts up a leaf and under it is a worm. So he says to his Talmud, you should understand, when Hashem created the world, he realized that at this time the day would be very, very hot and this worm would be suffering from it. So he made a small breeze that should blow to cover this worm. The Baal Shem Tov taught that Hashem's hashkoch is on every single thing, even things that are non-living, like rocks. Every single thing, his hashkoch, and these things are there for a reason. So now others don't. The Rambam certainly didn't hold that way. So if you find people who and many others, I don't think in the Shiva world they're as extreme as much. But again, the point is you will have these kinds of differences. But as far as your basic type of life, the halacha, they shouldn't really be so much different. I mean, there's difference because of philosophy. I followed a Moshe Feinstein. What happened, by the way, is yeshiva. It's not Hasidic. And when we get to that, I'll explain to you why I follow him more than others, and why I think his views are in many ways better, his approach and everything. But the point is that, there'll be some differences because of that. And I don't think that these are important. More important, you should find a rabbi who's a scholar who knows this stuff and then follow what he says, as opposed to, the kinds of differences that you see. Shlomo says this, so I don't care what no, you have a rabbi, you follow what he says, and that's what it is. Don't think my ego is being insulted by that. Him and me and your rabbi will argue in private about this, why this, we'll go away and, have a cup of coffee. Well, I didn't coffee, but we'll tea or whatever together afterwards. But, that kind of thing. So that's what the difference is. For a Noahide, these are differences to know what it's about, because when you're speaking to somebody, you're going to think that, for example, if it's a person to Lubavitcher, you're going to find much more interest in them talking about their Chabad Hasidus with you. Issues from there, where I wouldn't think that's important. In fact, I don't think Chabad Hasidus is appropriate for Noahides. It's much too Kabbalistic, and basically many of the terms would take a very long time to explain. And in fact, I think most Chabad Hasidim don't even understand what the terms are either anyway. So, so it's a different story like that. So, bottom line, these aren't important. But again, this, the only time it's of importance is when it comes to conversion. It's not conversion. You're looking for somebody who's a rabbi who's knowledgeable. That's the most important thing. A rabbi who is knowledgeable, that when he says something, you can rely upon it, that what he's coming at his decision is coming from a true understanding of what the halacha is supposed to be, rather than, just winging it, which I won't mention names, but there's a lot of people I know who are involved who basically just wing it without having a clear understanding of the halachic implications. As far as finally God would come to when you ask about what am I allowed to learn. I mean, they ignore the fact that there's a clear understanding from the Rambam that Noahides are not allowed to learn Torah, and there's very strong. It's not everything's allowed, and just this is forbidden. It's everything's forbidden, and just this is allowed. And some of it has some very logical reasons too. Okay, Veronica, I hope that helped out what I was trying to say. It's as we get closer to the 20th century, you're going to see things become familiar. If you've had any interaction with the Jewish world, you're going to see what goes on. Okay, oh, this is familiar because of that. Okay, there's two. But I really know of no Sephardim who involved Noahides that I consider reliable. There are two people who are actually Sephardic who I know they do something for Noahides, but I don't recommend them because I don't like their approach. I don't like their approach for Jewish people, and even when it's even worse as far as Noahides. Not that what they're saying in general is not true, but their approach is problematic, so I cannot recommend them. So I don't really know somebody among the Sephardim who are level-headed as people that I know who happen to be Ashkenazim. Just personality-wise. Okay, any more questions? If not, we will leave it to Dan. I will stop the. Any questions? Anything else? Anyone want to discuss anything?
Very interesting material for sure.